Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Knopper. I'm the Clerk Senior Administrator for the Town of St. Andrews. Tonight, we are hosting a municipal plan background study and consultation for the public as it relates to the new municipal plan going forward for Bayside, Shamcook, and St. Andrews. Tonight, we have with us CAO Chris Spear and Xander Gopin, Senior Planner, a little bit about the functionality for tonight. For those that are in attendance, we will be taking questions throughout the process. So I'll be monitoring this section. Please raise your hand. You'll find the raise hand section in your Zoom controls. And if you just raise your hand, I will alert Mr. Gopin about questions coming in and allow you to speak. As well, this meeting is being streamed to Facebook, and we will also be recording this meeting and putting it on our YouTube channel, Town of St. Andrews YouTube. So right now, I'll toss it off to Chris Spear, CAO.
Thanks, Paul. Just a quick question. Is the chat feature also available to people through the Zoom?
Chat feature is also available, correct.
So folks, feel free to use that if the presentation's a mid-sentence and you have a thought. So again, welcome everybody. This is our fourth presentation on the Municipal Background Report as we're continuing the process to update the municipal plan as requested and required under the Community Planning Act. We've had previous in-person sessions at Shamcook, Bayside, and earlier this week at the Arena in St. Andrews. And so for those that may not have been able to attend, we're offering this as a last effort on this particular phase. It should be noted that any comments we'll be taking moving forward for several more months as this process takes a bit, but it's going over the municipal plan and kind of the priorities of the community as we start to form our development bylaws. Xander will go over all those things, and so I'll hand it over to him. Thank you, Xander.
Xander, just one comment before that. If anybody can't send comments through the chat or raise their hand online, you can email pnopper, PNOPPER at townofstandrews.ca, and I will receive your questions through email. Go ahead, Mr. Gopin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Knopper, Mr. Spear. Assuming everybody can hear me, and I'm going to jump into a presentation. There's quite a bit of information in the presentation. Part of the requirements under the Community Planning Act are to prepare a background study before you do a municipal plan. And this is a lot of what I'll be sharing with you tonight, this kind of early phase research. There's really no bylaws that are drafted at this point. And I'll explain what the different planning bylaws are and what their role is and how they function and what the current bylaws are. And I will provide some early kind of ideas of directions that the new bylaws may go in based on what we found in the background study so far. Most of the information in the background study is coming from the census, which was last done in 2021. And a lot of that gets compared to 2016 to see changes over time. As well, there's a lot of mapping data that comes from mostly the province, some of our own data. And there were some key stakeholder interviews. I don't talk too much, key informant interviews. I don't talk too much about those in the presentation, but they are included in the background report itself. And I think you can find that whole thing on the town's website. So I'll start with a quick overview of planning bylaws. And it's the Community Planning Act, which is a piece of provincial legislation. That's what provides authority for all municipal bylaws, all municipal planning bylaws. There's other acts which do other things and give other bylaws authority. But for municipal plan, zoning, and subdivision bylaws, as well as a few others I'm not going to talk about tonight, they come from the Community Planning Act. And the municipal plan contains binding policies and proposals that reflect the public interest in a community. And the Community Planning Act specifies what needs to be in a municipal plan. Although it's fairly vague. I'm actually just going to jump out of this for a second. I'm not sure what's being shared right now, but I'm just going to read out what those are. Statements of policy with respect to development and use of land in the municipality, conservation and improvement of the physical environment, climate change adaptation and mitigation, control and abatement of all forms of pollution of the natural environment, development of communication, utility, and transportation systems, reservation and projected use of land for municipal purposes, provision of municipal services and facilities, including sewage, water, solid waste, education and culture, recreation, parks, playgrounds, other open spaces, fire and police, cemeteries, crematoria, urban renewal, housing, preservation of buildings and sites of historical interest, facilities for the provision of health and social services, housing, including affordable housing and rental housing, coordination of the council, the programs of the council relating to economic, social, physical development of the community, and any other matters, in the opinion of council, that are advisable. So those are kind of the broad areas for the municipal plan, and not all of those may explicitly be municipal responsibilities. Some of those are provincial, but there's still maybe municipal support, municipal provision in some way. So that's where that comes from. And a zoning bylaw, which is maybe more for day-to-day kind of land use stuff, the bylaw that gets pulled out more. That's a way to implement part of the land use policies in the municipal plan, and anything else that really ties back to land use and how a particular property is used, how a particular area is developed. Those things are specified in the zoning bylaw. And a municipality will have multiple zones, typically with different uses allowed, different intensity of uses, different densities of population. Sometimes there are additional conditions for land uses that are contained within zones. There may be general conditions for residential development or commercial development. And these are developed by the community with help from planners. They're ultimately approved by council. So my role is really as someone to draft and do the research behind it. And then it's up to council to kind of go through the political process of making sure that these bylaws are, the right fit for the community and are passed appropriately. So planning bylaws can be very powerful. They can make attempts to prevent conflicts between land uses. A good planning bylaw will certainly do that. A bad or not particularly well-planned one can exacerbate conflicts between land uses. Ideally, they protect the safety and well-being of the public. They can safeguard the environment. They support vibrant rural and urban economies, but they cannot settle civil disputes. So if you're arguing with a neighbor, they're not going to be the tool for that. They will change over time. The Community Planning Act makes it very clear that these documents are expected to change as economies change, and there's different federal or even global kind of shifts in policies. So there's amendment clauses. There's ways for variances to happen. There's almost always a public process involved in that, but these are not set in stone, and they are expected to change over time. They don't necessarily change anything that's happened before. So if you have an existing use, if it was legal under a zoning bylaw or under no zoning bylaw, because I think in St. Andrews, the first zoning bylaw came in 1969, certainly use is older than that. They're grandfathered in. So they don't become illegal uses. They don't have to change. There are some limits placed on their expansion, but the use can continue. And that's often a question people have as these bylaws are starting to change. So the current regime of bylaws for the St. Andrews Peninsula, I guess in some ways it's an artifact of the time before local government reform. We have bylaws for Bayside, which is this area over here, the Bayside Rural Plan, which was developed in 2009. The St. Croix Corridor South Rural Plan, which runs through both Bayside and Shamcook, as well as it goes up through Oak Bay and through St. Stephen as well, all along the St. Croix, and actually runs all the way up to McAdam on the river there. It runs past there on a separate bylaw, but it's in effect within 30 meters of the waterway, and it's certainly a plan that protects the environment. It really strictly limits development within 30 meters of the waterway and has requirements for preservation of trees and restrictions on tree clearing. Just this last year, the municipality passed a subdivision bylaw for the whole peninsula. So it's the first kind of bylaw for everywhere, but it has different standards for different types of roads, different requirements, whether you're in town or out of town. Depending on the type of development, is it a high density, apartment style development? We've run one of those through this. Is it more of a lower density single family neighborhood? There are different standards for different types and different locations. So we've been working with that for a little bit, and it seems to be working quite well. Shamcook is fairly similar to Bayside. It has a rural plan that was developed around the same time in 2011. We're now 13 and 15 years out from when those were developed. So they are they're up in years for sure. It's got that same St. Croix Corridor South Rural Plan. Subdivision bylaws in effect there too. And in the old municipality of St. Andrews, or the town site, we sometimes call it, there's the most complex regime. So there's a municipal plan, which I worked on in 2020. And that's got the policies and proposals, the zoning bylaw, which I was also involved in. That was the most up-to-date version is 2022. We've been doing a lot of amendments. I think we're up to Z 2210 on that. And a lot of those have come recently. And that's actually a good indication that there's maybe some issues with the way that this bylaw is working. If council's spending a lot of time on amendments and improving them, then maybe it's time to open up some of those standards and see if they're really working for the way the community is now. Secondary municipal plan is just for the town plat and historic business district. It's probably the most specific in terms of design. In the historic business district, it does get into types of materials that you can put on your facade. In the town plat, it's really dealing more with massing and scale of buildings. So how do they fit in with the kind of shapes and forms and locations of the other buildings on a block? Again, it's not perfect, and there's some amendments that have been made to it. So it's certainly up for discussion in this round. And finally, the subdivision bylaw, that's in effect, again, in the whole peninsula. So moving to the future, consolidating these, updating them, one municipal plan for the entire peninsula with different policies and proposals that will impact rural areas and serviced areas and different types of developments. So it's not a one size fits all, but it's one plan. Zoning bylaw, same idea. Certainly not one size fits all. The type of development you can do in a serviced area with water and sewer is very different than the type you can do in an unserviced area where you're on well and septic. So one zoning bylaw for the whole peninsula, but certainly multiple zones that will be more, some will be more geared towards the existing characters of Bayside and Shamcook, and maybe some tweaks to the municipality as well. Subdivision bylaw, we've done it, and it seems to be working well so far. Secondary municipal plan, it's worked fairly well, but there may be some issues with it, so it might get a bit of review. And the St. Croix Corridor South Rural Plan, fairly recent, and has been working quite well in terms of protecting trees and making sure that people aren't developing too close to the shoreline. In the last consultation, there was a question about erosion. And while there certainly are techniques you can undertake once your shoreline has started to erode, not being near the shoreline is probably the safest way of not being impacted by erosion. So the previous background study that I was involved in 5 years ago, over 5 years ago, it's interesting to look back on that and see some of the areas where the municipality has met some of those challenges and is sort of dealing with them, and some other areas where there's more challenges and there's still more work to be done. So year-round business, and I do have some data on this a little bit later, but it does seem like year-round businesses are growing. Also seen a lot of local and shoulder season tourism. So the tourism season is expanding. and where people are coming from. Although oftentimes it's closer to home. I think a lot of local New Brunswickers discovered St. Andrews during the pandemic and want to keep coming back. Institutional growth in St. Andrews, what I'm really talking about are the research institutions, so the Huntsman and the biological station. When you look at employment data, which we'll do in a little bit, we're seeing drops in these clusters. And for an important part of the economy, that's of concern. Green and recreational spaces and programming, there's been, I think, a lot of advances in this area. There's a dedicated recreation program manager. There's work on a recreation master plan, and there's a lot more programming in the recreational spaces that do exist. A lot more on offer for folks to enjoy. Shamcook Lake was talked about a lot in terms of the water supply and some of the challenges around it not being within the municipal boundaries. That's changed due to local governance reform. So there's maybe more options the municipality has for protecting Shamcook Lake to make sure that the drinking water supply is maintained and that it's the watershed as well is healthy. Parking, I think that's one of the areas where we still see a lot of challenges, and more people visiting does create more parking challenges. Internet is something we heard a lot about, especially on Water Street, some connectivity challenges. And I think technology has sort of advanced to the point where this is no longer as much of an issue, where we're moving away from wired in fiber optic cable to better satellite options. My guess is this is much less of a concern now. Healthcare, federal concern as well as local, but the municipality has put some effort behind that with space in the arena, working to attract healthcare professionals. Coastal buffer, so as well as the St. Croix corridor within 30 meters of the water in town. Not quite as stringent due to the historic development patterns and the fact that you do have a lot of development to the coastline already, but there is a bit of a coastal buffer within the town site within 30 meters of the water. Sea level rise was addressed in the previous zoning bylaw municipal plan with a special zone and elevation requirements. There's new projections and new data, so those should be updated. And the municipality has made a lot of progress in housing. Was just looking at unit number data today, and in terms of the units approved last year, it was a record high. And a lot of those are going to come online soon, and there's a lot more in the pipeline. So lots of apartment development happening with one new building for sure, and some others that have early approvals. But there's still probably a need for more diversity of housing, more small, affordable ownership options. So I'll jump into some of the data right now, and we start with the population. And population growth is the big story here for New Brunswick, for Canada, but really for the former municipal boundaries. So 14.7% growth is, I think that's the highest municipality in New Brunswick. In terms of actual numbers, obviously, Moncton is way ahead there, but in terms of growth, 14.7% is huge. And historically, if you look back before 2016, there were periods of stagnation and decline. So we're still, for the town site, not at the maximum it's ever been, but it is good to see that healthy level of growth. The former local service districts are less growth, but when taken as a whole, it's certainly pretty significant. And for all intents and purposes, it seems like that growth is continuing. The 2021 data would have been collected in 2020. And as you can see from the graphs on the right, while we don't have specific to St. Andrews data, population growth in the whole province has actually increased since that time. So most recent data for the entire peninsula as of 2023 was just over 3,000. These maps show a little bit of how the population is just distributed, how the population change has been distributed. So this on the top right, the population increase, I think that's pretty interesting to look at where that's happening. And I touched on that in the previous slide, but you can actually see it a little bit more broken down here. And it's not directly within the town plat where you're seeing a lot of the growth. It's in the adjacent serviced areas within the old boundaries of the municipality. One other thing that's interesting is that the percent of dwellings occupied by usual residents, so the bottom left here, that is increased. And it's not a direct correlation between fewer vacation homes and increase of usual occupation by usual resident, but that's one conclusion that can be drawn from that. So there's more permanent residents, less people who are, using St. Andrews as a summer home. And that has implications for services and everything as well. Still have, while there's certainly been some densification, especially on the outskirts, there's, compared to even St. Stephen or Eastern Charlotte, the municipality of St. Andrews is not quite as dense, even the old town site. And further discussions with municipal staff and public works will get a better sense of the servicing capacity within the serviced area. But my understanding is there's still a fair amount of room to grow, at least from that point of view. So another important aspect of the population demographics are the age of the population. And another kind of familiar New Brunswick story is aging, although it is more pronounced in this area than in other parts of the province. You can see the median age is quite a bit higher all over the St. Andrews Peninsula, and it's been getting higher at a faster rate than it has in the rest of the province. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it has implication for services and amenities that are needed. And we can also see different segments of the population, different age brackets, and how they're changing. One thing that's pretty clear is that school-age children are decreasing almost in every area. And there are more folks in the 70s and the 80s in those higher age brackets. And there's been increases in those populations. So they're making up a greater segment. And while accessibility is good for everybody, aging populations do require more specialized facilities. So working with groups like the Passamaquoddy Lodge and the province, who's kind of more responsible for that directly than the municipality, but the municipality can certainly be supportive and, is put in allowed use of land potentially. So definitely important to consider aging, and St. Andrews is an age-friendly community. There's been a lot of work in that area to make it age-friendly. In terms of income, St. Andrews and the entire peninsula is in a fairly healthy state, it looks like, although there are some caveats. There is a significant increase in Bayside. Some folks have speculated that there's some gentrification happening with a lot of homes changing hands during the pandemic. A lot of folks maybe coming from other parts of the country with higher salaries. And that could be impacting this, and especially maybe in Bayside, that had a significant impact. The entire census period was marked by a pretty radical economic shift in terms of people being able to go to work, in terms of employment income, and where other income was coming from. So CERB is sort of seen as this that had a significant impact on the census. And while the data shows a lot of low-income measures decreasing, I think we all know that increased challenges with housing, with food security, it's pretty clear that if maybe there was a decrease between 2016 and 2021, poverty is a significant issue, and it's probably growing. We do see it more visibly in other parts of the county, but I think to assume it does not exist in St. Andrews is incorrect. And again, there are services, there are folks who are involved in community suppers and things like that. So important to be aware of. I talked about employment a little bit and where we're seeing growth and maybe decline and change in those areas. And I can no longer see the top of my screen because of these things. So participation rate, that's people in the workforce. So maybe you're not employed, but if you're actively looking for work, then you're in the workforce. And that's declining in all areas. There's less people in the workforce. The town site, the former municipal boundaries, have seen increases in the overall employment rate. And we do see some more year-round businesses, so maybe that's contributing to that. We can see some of the individual areas where things have changed. So big increases in accommodation and food services everywhere except for Shamcook. And also what I'm sort of referring, so that falls into that businesses catering to tourists. Other services, that is where you would find folks like personal support workers. That's increased significantly. There may be other things in there like house cleaning services, those kinds of things. So again, those are businesses that are probably catering to retirees and tourists. Those have increased significantly. Construction, manufacturing, and primary resource industries have decreased. Mostly across the board, there's a little bit of an increase there in Shamcook, although big decrease in manufacturing. And I mentioned this earlier, there is a decrease in professional, scientific, and professional services. So that's 54 here. You can see the decrease in Shamcook. You can see it in St. Andrews. And it's actually probably not gone to zero. That's probably a data thing, but significantly decreased in Bayside as well. So that's probably concerning given the importance of that sector to the economy. How much the municipality can do to support it. There's some things that maybe the Huntsman, there's land, there's servicing, maybe there's some potential there, and there are some ongoing discussions, I know. So it's worth keeping an eye on and doing what the municipality can. Immigration, it's not a whole lot to say here. It kind of is the same story of the economy. Of the population. There is growth, and a lot of that is coming from immigration as well as interprovincial migration. There's really no population growth coming from births at this point. There is, when I talk with the Multicultural Association, they're one of those key informants, they tell me that there's still problems with folks settling in the community. A lot of people will come here, they'll work for a little bit, but then they end up moving to a larger center where maybe there's more folks from their home countries. We do see a little bit of an increase in retention, but it's still a challenge. And as I said before, this is really where a lot of the population growth is coming from. It's immigration. The population slide kind of showed a breakdown between immigration and interprovincial migration. But it is important to know how the population is growing and where it's growing. And also in terms of younger populations, those are much more likely to be newcomers than interprovincial migrants, or obviously a birth is going to be the youngest possible, but the newcomer population does tend to skew younger. And those newcomers, probably not surprising given transportation and housing challenges coming to a new country, they're most likely to settle in the town site where transportation is easier and it's easier to find rental housing. Speaking of, the only place really to find rental housing or that style of housing outside of the municipality is maybe a little cottage here and there in Shamcook and Bayside, but even in St. Andrews, the predominant form of housing is still the single detached dwelling. There is an increase in other types in St. Andrews, the old town site. There's more apartments. There's really that's the biggest area of growth. And you can see actually it's a decrease in movable dwellings in Bayside and Shamcook. So that would be your mobile homes and mini homes. There's actually a slightly lesser proportion of those. and this is as 2021. There's overall been a general decrease. Yes.
Sorry to jump in just quickly. I think it's important to point out that this data is a little old. We've had a lot of expansion within St. Andrews in the last year or two that aren't quite reflected. So the number of apartments and rental units has gone up substantially since the last census data that will be shown or considered as part of all this process.
Yeah, for sure. And in terms of the number of apartment dwellings that currently exist in St. Andrews that you could rent today, if they were on the market, versus what is approved right now and is either in development or could be developed, those numbers are about equal. So in terms of what could be coming, it is a significant growth, and that's a good thing because the vacancy rate has been so low for so long. So adding new rental units is really the only way to bring up that one of the only ways to bring that up and give people more choices, and hopefully the market responds to that by lowering prices, although it takes a lot of in some cases non-market rentals to actually start really impacting the market. I do talk a lot about housing as well. So I'm not going to go too much into it here. It is something that council's heard me talk a lot about, and there's really good data on it, and we have a lot of it. In terms of dwellings being constructed, there has been a general decrease until maybe 2015, and then we start seeing that jump up again. And again, we do have data since 2021, especially within the municipality, and especially in rental dwelling units. There's a lot. In 2023, 70 dwelling units were approved, and I think that's off of 30 permits. So the more units per permit, the more likely it is those are rental dwellings. These are affordability numbers. So it's what are people spending on their rents or on their mortgages or on their general housing costs, if you're not renting or have a mortgage. And from that, you can get a really good sense based on income of, are people spending too much or too little on their housing? Affordable housing is more and more in the news these days, and there's more questions about what does affordable mean, because we all have different definitions. A lot of us pretty much everybody wants to live in something affordable, but depending on your disposable income, what that is varies greatly. So I won't talk about all the specific numbers. Where we do see some of what look like decreases, so renters spending more than 30% of their income, looks like a decrease, but we've got to remember that income was pretty significantly affected by CERB and other benefits during the pandemic. And I think this number is really important to keep an eye on, how much more it costs to rent an apartment in 2021 than it did in 2016, and that number is probably higher still. And that's a greater increase than the rest of the province, and jumped from being lower than the provincial average to higher than the provincial average. And that's sort of indicative of this point that rentals struggle far more than owners in terms of affordability, in terms of spaces that are suitable, in terms of size, being big enough or being too big, and also in terms of condition of the units themselves. As I've said a lot before, and as Mr. Spears mentioned, there's been a lot of progress in these housing goals, and we have seen the vacancy rate come up. It's great to have baseline data and be able to do another study and say, hey, like your vacancy rate went from 2% to 4%, which is starting to get into that healthy range. So good progress, still probably work to do, and certainly a consideration for the next municipal plan and zoning bylaw, but also understanding the service and capacity, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The natural environment is, in some ways, it does relate to service and capacity, is when you're thinking about drinking water and Chamcook Lake, it has a certain capacity. The town is not the only user of that watershed. There's also water drawn for wells in the area, for residents, but probably more significantly for the industrial park. And I believe there's work currently on a study to determine how much water is being used, and kind of create a water budget. And that is, there is a water budget in existence that's regulated by the province. But understanding the watersheds and the water capacity is very important, for making sure that the town is resilient and can keep growing. There's lots of important conservation areas within the municipal boundaries. The Shamcook watershed itself is under provincial regulations relating to public health and safety. There's regulation around wetlands and water courses that is provincial. There's preserved natural areas. There's a St. Croix corridor. There's environmentally sensitive areas, wildlife habitats, land that's owned by the Nature Trust or has been given through covenant to them to manage. So there's a lot of different overlapping, and ideally not conflicting conservation areas and legislation. One thing that a municipal plan and zoning bylaw can help to do is bring those into alignment. And we can't really impact the provincial legislation, so it's important to not allow things that would not otherwise be allowed. For example, within 15 meters of a wetland, the province isn't letting people develop there, then there's no reason that the municipality should indicate that it may be possible to do so. Another important aspect of the natural environment, and something we're dealing with really in real time now, is climate change. And a very important aspect of that in St. Andrews is sea level rise, given that it's a fairly low-lying coastal area. And we have and will continue to see those impacts. There's adaptations that can be made. You've got critical infrastructure like the causeway at Katie's Cove and the gate. Making sure you adapt them so that they can withstand stronger and stronger storms, as the municipality did. That's a really important reason to look at your infrastructure and what's vulnerable currently. And as I said before, there are new projections. So taking another look at that sea level rise zone and making sure it's in line with those. Some of these larger pieces of infrastructure are going to take a lot of money to adapt, and it's not within the municipality's capabilities. So working with other levels of government, as you're doing on the Market Square and Wharf project, to raise those. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges that come with those, but they're really the only way forward. In terms of mitigation and trying to make sure that we're not adding to the problem, efficient land use is really important and has all sorts of benefits that go beyond just lower greenhouse gas emissions. But the town site itself and the town plat, where you can live and walk to work and to the grocery store, and to parks and to art galleries, and really everything you need in a community is within walking distance or biking distance for those who can do it. And even if you have accessibility challenges, maybe being close enough to not have to get in a car, that might be helpful as well. So that style of development that St. Andrews started with and the town site has continued is one of the best ways to mitigate climate change, because makes it easier for people to get around and use less energy in doing so. And the town has engaged in some pretty interesting energy planning processes that could even enhance some of the connections between buildings to use things more efficiently. I guess there's mixed opinions on the need for clear cutting entire properties for development, for large scale developments. And it's a newer area for municipalities to get involved with, outside of kind of environmentally significant areas. I believe it's Dieppe has a tree bylaw that requires permits and things for the cutting of trees on private property. So I think it's worth thinking about. But is this the best solution? Again, making sure that people can develop more densely in places that are already largely developed. That's one thing that will help eliminate the clearing of trees in outlying areas for developments that need to be lower density due to the servicing capacity. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Talked about provincial regulation and legal statutes. There are other ones. Statements of public interest are one that I'll talk about in the land use section. And deer, they're a part of the natural environment, as much as we are frustrated by them sometimes and the way they eat our gardens. Obviously there's attempts the municipalities making to deal with that. The land use implication is really about fencing, in my experience, because people need fences to keep deer out of their yards. And currently there are fairly stringent regulations on fencing, which require a lot of PAC time and staff time to get to a fairly standard outcome. And that's a pretty good indication that we can standardize a lot of that, put it in the bylaw, and not have to go to a committee for every single front yard fence in the municipality over 3.3 feet. Natural resources. I think St. Andrews is quite lucky to have not only good soil, but some farmers who are willing to work with that soil. So Bantry Bay, Foods Good Farm, I think Little Acres. There's still not, I'd say, historically what has been known on the peninsula. Bayside was known as a really great turnip growing area, to the point where certain nutrients were depleted from the soil. We don't see that level of agriculture at this point, but there are market gardens. There are, there's a good farmers market where you can go and buy produce. As someone from St. Stephen, I'm a little bit jealous of that. But it's something that hopefully will continue to grow. And you can see more of it in town. I think the town supporting a food forest project is a great way to increase knowledge of agriculture and innovative and very traditional agricultural practices. Not very much in the way of mineral claims on the peninsula. There's other acts and regulations that deal with that. And I don't think there's anything even in the early exploration stages. And the way these claims work, they're huge swaths of area. So at this point, I think it's really not something that is of concern. I did talk about in the employment how we're not seeing as many people working in these primary resource sectors like agriculture, fishing, and forestry. There may be issues with livestock in some of the rural areas, and there may be some land use conflicts that have developed between some rural residents because of different understandings of what a rural area is and different opinions. And for some folks, that's having lots of animals, and for other folks, that's a very quiet, peaceful, tranquil environment. And those two things don't always go together. So good planning sets ground rules that seek compromise, and I think that's something we'll have to look at for the rural areas in this plan. Another important thing, kind of in that same vein, is clear standards for fishery and aquaculture uses, really distinguishing between small scale and large scale, what can exist near residential areas and what really can't and belongs maybe in an industrial park. So there are a lot of aspects to the economy. One of the interesting things about local governance reform is it diversified the economy just by growing the boundaries of the municipality, and now there's an industrial park, which is a huge opportunity. The more traditional kind of town site economy has been based on accommodations and tourism, and COVID obviously had an impact on that, but there is rebound and growth, and there is growth in those shoulder seasons, especially October and June. We're seeing more tourists than ever in those months, and still very strong the rest of the more kind of summer months as well. And I think the post-COVID rebound has happened, and St. Andrews, as you can kind of see from Kingsbury, actually didn't have a huge dip in the number of visitors during those pandemic years. An area, again, for maybe a hotspot for land use conflicts is tourism accommodations. So these small scale ones like glamping domes, they're pretty low impact, but then you can get into things like campgrounds and while there are some in existence, the proliferation of them, especially large ones, could lead to land use conflicts. And it's something that needs to be considered for sure. Food trucks, something the council is considering, and I believe they're intending to update the peddler's bylaw, which by its name you can probably assume is fairly old. I think it dates back to the 70s or 80s. Food trucks were not really a thing back then, and it's there have been a number of requests and applications, and I think it needs to be addressed in the zoning bylaw and align with whatever is allowed in a separate local governance act permitting bylaw. Private cannabis retail was pretty vague in the last bylaw and did allow for a store to open through conditions. So that's open now, and I don't know if Cannabis NB would license another store, but it's ultimately up to the municipality to say if they would be okay with another one or if they feel like one is enough. I think in other small communities, there's probably no need for any more than one. So I think a clear kind of direction, are they just generally allowed, or is it requiring amendments and things like that if you want to open another one? And as I said, the industrial park and the Port of Bayside, huge economic opportunity, not just for the municipality, but for the region. As something within the municipality, if council does want to be more involved in how it grows and develops, a secondary plan, which would have some policies and proposals in it, as well as some land use requirements. Something to consider, not necessarily required. There is one for the St. Stephen Industrial Park that deals with new servicing that would be done by the municipality, which wouldn't be the case, I think, in this industrial park, but something to consider. Land use and settlement patterns. So fairly typical for rural areas. Settlement is limited to the roads. With these kind of desirable coastal areas, you will see these coastal settlement patterns as well. And then, of course, with the town site, you've got that real level of density with all sorts of uses and more services that allow for that. And still the majority of the land base is forest. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, unlike a lot of areas in the province, there isn't a ton of forestry happening in the St. Andrews Peninsula. And when you look at the land ownership, it is mostly small landholders. So I don't really expect that to change. Another way to look at land use is where are buildings, and it follows a very similar pattern to these settlement areas, hugging the roads. Moving forward, these statements of public interest, which are provincial legislation, they're fairly new. All planning bylaws and planning decisions need to conform with them. So these plans will need to, and they direct growth to serviced areas or existing roads. So having long cul-de-sacs coming off of the 127 going into the interior of the peninsula, I think those are going to be, from a provincial point, they're really going to be challenging. The province wants to cut down on them. They have issues for public safety, as well as financial sustainability. I'll talk about the public safety in a minute. The existing rural plans, we've dealt with a fair number of land use conflicts, some of them to the point of appeals. And in my opinion, it's really due to the fact that at the time they were created, there was very little development pressure. There was very little change. And so allowing lots of different uses was a fairly risk-free thing to do. And it was unlikely that more intensive ones would actually develop. That's changing. And there's also more pressure for residential development, especially in these really beautiful coastal areas. So we need better planning in those rural areas. And I know at the time there was a lot of work and effort that went into those rural plans, and the objectives and policies are really important to review to kind of get the sense of what people were thinking at the time and what people at the time valued about those places. But that was about 15 years ago. So one of the reasons why we're doing this at this point for St. Andrews is to bring those plans up to date. And if we're bringing those up to date, we're doing the whole thing. That's the provincial regime at this point. I talked about rural resource activities already, like aquaculture, forestry, farming. When it gets to be more intensive, it can't exist super close to residential settlement anymore. There are smaller scale uses which are probably compatible. A few lobster traps in a yard is very different from a 7,000 square foot lobster holding facility. So that's an important nuance to understand and try to incorporate into plans moving forward. For those large scale uses, having an industrial park is great. And my understanding from having discussions with those folks is there is room. There's some plans to stop quarrying and cover those sites and have them be available for warehouse and other maybe manufacturing or again, a lot of potential. Talked about the road networks already. And I did talk about the kind of ability to have multiple modes of transport within the old municipal boundaries. There's still a lot of challenges regionally, getting off the peninsula, getting to St. John or Fredericton or St. Stephen. If you don't have a personal vehicle, that's going to be challenging. There's a couple new options in town and some older ones like Dial-A-Ride, which are still a great service. Parking downtown, still a major challenge. And I think there's been, maybe a little bit of progress with I don't want to say exactly development of the former Legion as a parking lot, but since it can be used as that, it's certainly helping a little bit. But kind of thinking better about that parking situation, a more permanent solution that could take some of the pressure off the need for every property to provide parking on site with new residential development, which would make it a little bit easier to get more density in that downtown area. So infrastructure and municipal services. The municipality does have a fairly robust asset management plan when it comes to managing the existing infrastructure, the pipes in the ground, the roads. And it's important to think about future growth and how that's going to impact your ability to service what you have now. There's certainly good reasons to grow the infrastructure network, but it's important to make sure that growth pays for growth. Talked about the Shamcook Lake watershed, and that's a very important piece of municipal infrastructure. The picture down here is of the forest fire that happened in Boquebec last summer, I guess just about a year ago, and technically outside of the municipal boundaries, but obviously the municipality was very affected and very involved in the response to it. And I think watching from the outside, it was very impressive to see the municipality and community come together. And while it's fairly hard to do something about the challenging development patterns, the road with the bridge to nowhere, that could potentially have been a very serious situation if people had been trapped down that road. And at the same time, there were forest fires in the suburban areas around Halifax with cul-de-sac developments that were very hard to get people out of because there's only one entrance and exit. So there may be inherited problems, but those problems should not be perpetuated. And with new roads, again, to get those approved by through statements of public interest, through subdivision bylaws, considering emergency evacuation is baked into that. And needs to continue to be so. As new assets are developed, they can impact the existing levels of service. So being really aware of the municipality's financial resources. Generally, St. Andrews has been in very good shape. Everything has been kind of thrown off with local governance reform. It's created some new areas and changed old areas and made accounting seriously challenging, more so than it already was. And if anybody has questions about that, Chris Spear is a great person to talk to. Getting to the end of the presentation, I know it's a lot of information, but I think it's important to understand how we go about the process of planning and how we understand the community. And I think for a new kind of amalgamated community, there may be things about other areas in your municipality that you're learning for the first time. And so I think that's a important part of being a complete community is understanding a lot of it, and the geographic reaches of it. So heritage and history, very important to the St. Andrews Peninsula, going back, 20,000 years to First Nation settlement, the Bescoto Makati, lots of important sites in the area. Colonial history, St. Croix Island, one of the first sites that was loosely settled by a colonial power, abandoned not long after, but you have the historic site up there in Bayside. And then in town, there's lots of built heritage. So the courthouse is a very significant piece of built heritage that the municipality is that owns and is trying to find ways to activate. And there may be heritage bylaws. There's some consultations that will be coming up for that in August. I don't know if they've been formally advertised yet, but something for that is coming very soon. With archaeology, with large scale developments, it's going to be important to make sure that archaeological impact assessments are done where there's concern over potential artifacts, most likely First Nations. So again, it's something to keep in mind. It's something that would be included in those previous rural plans and municipal plans, but important to carry forward. Recreation and culture, St. Andrews is really rich in both of those areas. The recreation master plan is currently being worked on, and we'll maybe do a better job of identifying programming opportunities and linkages and where new recreational areas should be developed. And supporting the ongoing cultural expression of First Nations is something that I think the town has really been taking seriously in recent years. And I think it's really increased people's interest in the town and their desire to go to events and be a part of events. And having a council leading in that area is a very important part of reconciliation. There's great community events, not just in the municipality, but in Bayside and Shamcook as well. I will note, and it was kind of a learning experience to host the first one of these sessions in the Chapel of Ease in Shamcook, which is really the only publicly accessible place in that former local service district. And it's not great for community meetings. It's a beautiful space for worship, but not ideal for conversations like this. So it's worth noting that a place like the Bayside Community Hall that can host a community supper, have music, where people can feel really comfortable and relaxed, and come together. That's a very important part of community. And when we're doing processes like this, they're important spaces. So in terms of where we're going, we wrapped up phase one, which is the pre-consultation background study, and that's the information I've shared with you tonight, and that's available in the background report. We'll be doing some updating of that report based on the consultations, what we've heard, as well as some of those interviews. So we're right now in this public consultation phase. the first one of those. After that, we'll start on the bylaw drafting. We'll start consulting with provincial departments, which is a requirement under the Community Planning Act. And then once we start to have some idea of where things are going, it will be more public consultation and people will get a better sense of these are what the actual policies and proposals, zoning, land use allowances, standards, what will affect my property, what's happening to the neighborhood I'm living in. That's when we can really have those discussions. At this point, it's far too early to say. I've tried to give some kind of general directions of where things are going, based on the background study, based on experiences working as a planner in the community over the last 6 years, and talking with other folks and looking at best practices. But these will turn into actual policies and proposals and standards that will be legal documents. So it's very important that people have a good understanding of those and have the opportunity for feedback. And then council starts the formal adoption process, which includes more formal required consultations like public presentations, public hearing of objections. PAC would give their views. And ideally by the end of the year, it's adopted. That may be ambitious, but we're on track so far. And that's it for the presentation. So I'll stop sharing and I guess happy to answer any questions or just hear general ideas, concerns, thoughts, feelings. Very, very open-ended at this point. So if you have questions about anything I've said or anything, I'm happy to answer it. Or there may be other people here who can answer it. Or if you just want to say, here's what I think we should do, or I'm worried about this, this is the opportunity for that as well. And there's lots more opportunities. There's the survey. You can always write to council, to staff, email, call. We definitely want to hear from you.
Thank you, Mr. Gopin, for your presentation. It was very informative and provided a lot of background information that is necessary for the municipal plan. At this time, I'll offer anybody on the Zoom call here, if they would like to raise their hand to provide any questions or comments to your presentation, they can do so now, or you can write into the question and answer section that is provided in the chat or in the Q&A button. As well, anybody who is online watching on Facebook, you can email pnopper@townofstandrews.ca with any questions or comments. We'll leave this open for a few minutes to see if anybody's got any, and I'll provide them back. We did have one comment come in about the public sessions being held in Bayside and Shamcook were not well communicated to residents, and if there was a better mechanism to inform the public about this. I just want to note that we did do a mail out in June with the municipal plan survey to 1,500 residential homes and businesses. This was mailed out directly through a mail out flyer. If you do have a junk spam flyer rejection at the post office, at that point, you should go into the post offices and request that to be removed, because that's how we send out generalized information. As well, this has been posted on the town website since the beginning of June, posted out front of Town Hall, and any information that is provided here tonight can be found on our website, or you can come to Town Hall to provide your questions, comments, and we'll be more than happy to provide you any of the documentation that was listed tonight, municipal plans, rural plans for Shamcook and Bayside. I'll pass it off to Mr. Spears, CAO, for any comments that he has.
Thanks, Paul. I guess it really wasn't. I was just sitting here for support. But back to the comment of Mr. Mowat, we appreciate that. As Paul said, we tried our best through our normal means, and so we will take that back maybe before the next round. Not entirely sure what would be the best avenue after this, but maybe we will look at a couple of other enhancements, possibly with the emergency system, that we are able to put out just general public messages on Voyant. So if that would reach out a few people, and maybe through the newspaper. But we'll try and figure out what the best avenue is, but it's a struggle for many municipalities because traditional means of radio, newspaper, etc., just aren't working. And we certainly appreciate that not everybody is tuned in electronically into our social medias and website, but we will take that and see if we can figure it out a different strategy to enhance our current strategy to see if we can do anything there.
And Mr. Spear, just on that, the town just did install a digital sign at the WC Neal Arena, and we'll be making sure that more information is provided there for public view to help as people are driving into town and out of town. So keep an eye on that, and don't hesitate again to follow up with the town. Call us, visit us at Town Hall, 212 Water Street. We're more than happy to provide you any additional information and try to answer your questions as best as we can. Currently, at this time, we haven't received any further requests for questions or comments. Mr. Spear and Mr. Gopin, do you have any further or last comments?
I'll just say thank you for everyone who's participated. It's good to see the engagement. Just want to reiterate, I've heard a couple of people say on the streets that, Bayside and Shamcook don't want to lose their rural way of life. Well, good news. We don't want to take away your rural way of life either. Council's always said this process is to be driven by the residents out there. I think there's been some challenging files that have come across the planner's desk. Sorry, there's a cat trying to attack me here. That shows a need for some better land controls out there, but it won't be the same level as there is in the original town site. So please continue to be engaged and provide us guidance on these things, because I think it's such a strong tool for people to ensure that there's complementary development, I guess is the term that Mr. Zander would use, around their neighborhoods to make sure, I don't know, a car plant like from Ford isn't going to go ahead.
People have good expectations of what could happen in their neighborhoods.
Exactly. And I think it's fair to say that the rural plans try to touch on this, but as we saw, there were some challenges. And certainly the tools that are available to a municipality can tighten that up without making it significantly restrictive. So please keep in touch over the next several months, and we'll take back the comments on getting the message out better and try to see what we can do to do that. But it's also a challenge this time of year to engage people in the summer. So we're trying to figure out all the magic solutions, but we do appreciate everyone who took time to come in tonight to do it. And Mr. Gopin, anything else from you?
No, I will say word of mouth is probably the best way of informing people about these. And if you know someone and you let them know that this is ongoing, and you think it's important and they should get involved and give their feedback, then that's probably the most convincing way for someone. It's not as impersonal as a flyer in the mail or a announcement on a sign. So if you care about this, make sure that other people do too.
All right. So on behalf of the town of St. Andrews and the staff and those and Zander, who works with the Southwest New Brunswick Regional Service Commission, there's a mouthful. Have a great night, and we'll be in touch later.
So just one more follow-up here, folks. If you can go to www.townofstandrews.ca, on our main page, we have a button that says Take the Municipal Plan Survey. I encourage everybody who hasn't taken the survey to please go online before the end of July to take that survey. If you are not as digitally inclined, you can come to Town Hall and we'll provide you a paper copy of the survey, to which all of this will be collected, analyzed, and provided. You can also send letters to council with beyond any of the questions that we have on the municipal plan survey, and that will also be added to the data collection system. So again, thank you very much for your participation tonight, and have yourselves a great night.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.